inequalities. But most importantly for our purposes today, we had an economy that was extraordinarily dependent on fossil fuels, and we know the consequences of that. We need to move towards a green economy. There are other transformations that we are going to have to make, and some of these are actually very related to moving towards a green economy. We have to move towards a knowledge economy. And among the sectors that are going to be most adversely affected by the pandemic are the knowledge sectors. And strikingly, these are among the sectors that so far have received much less money, insufficient money to deal with the problems. So we don't want to go back to where we were. As we spend money, we ought to be thinking about the kind of economy we want to emerge post-pandemic. And this is where some of the research that we've been engaged in has highlighted what we can do. We can design packages that address the needs right now, but most importantly, address the recovery as the pandemic gets under control in ways that promote this green economy. So as we think about what are the kinds of characteristics that we want in recovery packages, we obviously want the spending to be timely. We want long-term investment projects that may take 5 or 6 years to fully implement are clearly not the kinds of things that we want. We want things that respond now in the emergency that we're in. Secondly, we want labor-intensive projects. And this is particularly important because among the sectors that are most adversely affected are those that are labor-intensive, and that's why unemployment has gone up, and particularly unemployment of unskilled workers, people in the hospitality sectors. And so it is important in addressing the problem of inequality, to which I referred earlier, and the particular nature of those who are likely to suffer, that we want labor-intensive projects. And thirdly, resources are scarce, particularly government budgetary resources are scarce. In the United States, for instance, our debt GDP ratio is forecast to be exceed well over 100% by September. The debt GDP ratio is likely to be 18%. While I'm not particularly worried about these numbers at this point, they do remind us of the scarcity of resources and of the importance of making sure that the spending be well spent. And that means targeting our short run and long run objectives. And the long run, of course, includes climate change. The short run entails big bang for the buck, which means, in other words, high multiplier. And what is very clear is that one can design green packages of recovery, which are satisfy all of these conditions: timely, labor intensive, and high multiplier. Now let me turn to the second question, which is, what are the mechanisms for ensuring that the money that we spent go to the objectives that we want, including a green economy? And there seems to me two fundamental aspects of this: how we allocate the funds. We should not be allocating the funds to save the sectors of the past. We should be allocating it to the sectors of the future, in particular the green sectors. But the second thing is, we ought to be willing to impose strong conditionality. We are providing enormous amount of assistance to the sector, to many sectors. It's a life and death measures for many enterprises. And in return for that assistance, we should expect them to behave in ways that are consistent with broad social objectives, treating labor decently, kinds of transparency, corporate governance, but most importantly for this purpose is moving towards a lower carbon footprint. So even if we decide to save the airline industry, we should insist that its carbon footprints be reduced. Some countries have done this. France has been very explicit in ensuring that those who receive the money agreed to conditions that move their enterprises, their airlines, in a direction with a lower carbon footprint. Before concluding, I want to say a word about the developing world and the emerging markets. They, at the very beginning of the pandemic, looked like they were among the most vulnerable. People live in crowded conditions, health conditions are worse, they don't have the resources to respond. And we are seeing in some parts of the world, in particular Latin America, those fears playing out. There well may be a real crisis in many countries beyond the kinds of crises that we've been having in the advanced countries. And as they face the crisis, these crises, they won't be able to do what they may have committed to do in Paris. They won't have the resources. And as both a humanitarian matter and as a matter of those committed to ensuring we move towards a green economy, we have to provide assistance to them. The most obvious way where the crisis will manifest itself is going to be debt crises. We're already seeing a couple countries that already had a large amount of debt. These problems bubble up. And we've seen that the private sector seems to have no conscience in the matter. In fact, in the case of Argentina, not only are they demanding payments beyond what the IMF says is sustainable, they are actually demanding that the new debt instruments go back on the kinds of collective action clauses that were introduced just a few years ago and open up the scope for vulture funds. It's really quite unconscionable. So at this moment, there are some both instruments and some, you might say, pressure that the developed countries can put. Pressure to have standstills while the rest of the world has been on standstill. The financial sector has continued to rack in money. But most transparently, the IMF has the power to issue $500 billion of SDRs, money that would make a great deal of difference. And so far, the IMF constituent countries have not supported this. Not surprisingly, there's one country that has played a big role in blocking this cooperative action to deal with this impending crisis. So one of the things I think the advanced countries should be doing is putting pressure on their governments to put pressure on the US government to ensure that there is this issuance of SDRs. And it might be accompanied appropriately with, again, the kind of conditions that make sure that the money goes to the countries move towards a green economy. So let me just conclude that this pandemic is obviously a moment of enormous stress for the entire world. But as we spend money to address that pandemic, we can use that money to help shape our economy towards the kind of economy and the kind of society we want going forward. So with that, let me open it up for questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. And we have got a question from Ethan Fisher, who submitted it in advance of the event. And he asks, what impact do you think the increase in anti-globalization rhetoric, which has been encouraged by the pandemic, will have on climate change progress, given that international cooperation on this global issue is so vital?
I think that the pandemic has emphasized that we live in one world. I know that the Trump administration has gone in the other direction and undermined global cooperation, not only in the area of climate, but also in the area of health. But more broadly, both among Americans and everywhere in the world, I think the pandemic has re-emphasized that we share one planet. The CO2 molecules and the coronavirus do not pay any attention to borders. And these global issues can only be addressed with global cooperation. So putting aside the particular, the peculiarities of the current US administration, I believe that emerging from the pandemic will be a renewed commitment to global cooperation. That doesn't mean that we've also recognized that the extremes of hyperglobalization that marked the era before the 2008 crisis, those days are over. We've seen that hyperglobalization has resulted in supply chains that were not resilient, that just as in the build up towards the 2008 crisis, markets are short-sighted. They focused on short-term profits, not long-term strength. We've seen that going on in the period leading up to the pandemic. So I think there will be a reassessment of these global supply chains, but I also think that there will be a commitment to more global cooperation in dealing with those issues that can only be addressed globally.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you particularly for ending on a slightly positive note. So we're now going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you very much again, Professor Stiglitz. And it's my pleasure to introduce Beata Javorcik, who is the Chief Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Beata, you have the floor. If you'd like to. Professor Stiglitz, you can turn your video off, and Beata is going to share some slides. Over to you, Beata.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be joining this conversation. In my brief remarks, I would like to focus on emerging markets. Now, if you go back in your memory to January of this year, the headlines have been dominated by climate change. In Davos, all the discussions revolved around green economy. So you may have gotten the impression that the private sector all over the world have subscribed to fighting global warming. Actually, that's not quite how things look in reality, particularly in emerging markets. Emerging markets lag behind very much when it comes to awareness and action on the climate front. Here you see results of a survey that was conducted by the EBRD in Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, Central Asia, Southern and Eastern Mediterranean. We surveyed about 18,000 firms. And what we saw is that while there are some firms with excellent green management practices, the vast majority of firms, as portrayed by this green line here, lag very much behind in action on climate front. And here, what we mean by green strategy is having climate-related objectives, having a person who is responsible for that, monitoring emissions, having emission targets. And it's quite interesting that the distribution of green management practices is much more skewed than the distribution on management practices or quality of management practices in general. Now, if you look at which firms do better in this respect, you see that foreign-owned firms are much better when it comes to green management, as are exporters. And a lot of incentive to take action on energy saving comes from customers as well as from regulation, particularly from taxes. So the first point is that there is little awareness and actually not enough action in emerging markets. My second point is that foreign direct investment can be an ally in our climate change mitigation efforts. So here, let me present results of a study focusing on Indonesia, and in particular, looking at 20 years of data capturing foreign acquisitions of Indonesian plants. And here the question is, what happens to energy efficiency when a plant changes ownership from domestic to foreign? The Indonesian data offer the advantage of very detailed information on type of energy sources, their quantity, and their value. And what this allows us to do is to compare energy efficiency within plants. Now, of course, when you want to get at the impact of foreign ownership, you don't want to compare plants before and after ownership change. Rather, you would like to compare their performance to a counterfactual. What would have happened to those plants had they not changed ownership? And the way to do it is to find a control group. Other plants similar in terms of size, similar in terms of energy efficiency, that operate in the same industry. And when you do that, you can trace the trajectories of plants that change ownership and their twins, the control group. And once you do that, what you see is that the two groups, the red line depicts the domestic control plants, the green line depicts the plants that change ownership from domestic to foreign. You see that these two lines diverge very much in the year when ownership change happens. And in particular, acquired plants that are now in foreign hands, improve their energy efficiency. Now, you can translate this energy usage into average CO2 emissions, and you see the same picture. You can compare value of energy input, you get the same picture. Now, if you ask, how is this happening? Well, there are three channels. One is the scale effect. Plants that change ownership from domestic to foreign produce output at a larger scale that presumably allows them to build in efficiencies. You also see that they employ new technologies. Namely, you see massive investment in machinery happening in aftermath of ownership change. Finally, you see improvements in productivity and changes to the production process. So it's not change in the product mix, there are also changes in efficiencies, changes to the production process. My third point is that the pandemic presents an opportunity to build awareness among firms in emerging markets. In our EBRD surveys, we asked firms, if you have not invested in improving energy efficiency, what was the reason? to almost 2/3 of firms said it's simply not a priority for us relative to other investments. And interestingly, there wasn't very much difference between firms of various sizes. Both large and small firms did not feel that energy efficiency is a priority for them. Lack of financial resources comes as a distant second, with only 10% of respondents citing this as a reason for the lack of investment in energy efficiency. But what we also see in the data, this is the data from those 18,000 firms surveyed, is that firms that have been exposed to extreme weather events and actually incurred financial losses due to extreme weather events are much more likely to engage in green management practices. So basically, having experienced on your own skin that climate change matters focuses your mind and leads to action. And that's why I think COVID presents an opportunity to talk about how humans encroach on the habitat of animals, and therefore we see emergence of viruses, and how humans are affecting the planet. And I think people during the pandemic may be much more receptive to those arguments. My final point is that we should use this pandemic as an opportunity to mobilize young voters. COVID has created intergenerational tensions. As in this recession, as in any recession, young workers tend to suffer disproportionately. The younger workers are the first ones who are often let go. Young people who enter the labor market during a recession tend to enter at lower wages, and it takes them a long time to catch up. Moreover, these debts that are being accumulated during the pandemic will fall on the younger generation. It will be the young people who will be paying off those debts for decades. Moreover, it's also the young people who will be bearing the burden of climate change and the cost of climate change mitigation. And because travel is more difficult, immigration is more difficult due to travel restrictions, due to protectionist measures in many countries, these young voters who would have under normal circumstances left their countries are likely to stay put. So if we can energize them to vote, we can actually create a shift in the political agenda towards more forward-looking issues. And even in emerging markets, this gap between voter participation among seniors, among mature people versus young people is there, it's persistent, and it's quite large. So I hope that we can count on young people to change the political discourse for the better. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Beata. And we do have time for a question, and we've received one from Mike Clark, who asks, do you have, and I think he means EBRD, does EBRD have greater equity-related capabilities to fund some of the projects the world needs? As a citizen, I have a stake in my state's balance sheet. My state has an equity stake in EBRD. So how can my citizen equity risk be linked to real economy green projects?
So at the EBRD, we reacted very early in the pandemic with solidarity packages. Our lending in the first 6 months of this year has been at record levels we've never seen before. And as we are going to enter the recovery stage, we are going to pursue what we call tilting to green strategy. We believe that nudging recipients of our equity investment and of our lending towards better behavior when it comes to green issues, to climate change, is something we ought to be doing.
Thank you very much, Beata, and thank you for keeping to time. Very, very disciplined. So excellent. I think we'll move on now to our next speaker, which is Professor Nicholas Stern, who is, I hope, ready to go. So thank you again, Beata.
Thank you very much, Bob. I hope you can hear me all right. What I wanted to do was to start with climate and COVID, because we're thinking about climate policy in the era of COVID. And let me just pick up on a remark that Beata made. What we've been doing on climate and biodiversity makes pandemics more likely. And it's very important that that argument is made clearly. The big majority of pathogens are zoonotic. They come to us from animals. And we're changing the relationship through what we're doing on climate and biodiversity. We're changing the relationship between and amongst wild animals, domestic animals, human animals. And as a result, we make the circumstances where new viruses can emerge more conducive to just that emergence. And if you think if we've had bird flu and we've had swine flu and we've had SARS and MERS and Ebola and HIV/AIDS, all emerging as a result of the interactions and new kinds of interactions between human animals, domestic animals, and wild animals. So we have to understand in a much deeper way than we have done before the profound interrelationship between climate, biodiversity, and pandemics. And I think we have to keep stressing that, because we've spoken about the big risks of climate change, and my goodness, they're enormous. But we haven't, I think, included often in that description of the risks, the problems of pandemics. And I think that is of fundamental importance. That's different from, of course, the changes in local climates moving where the malaria and dengue fever and others diseases are occurring. This is over and above that kind of phenomenon, though that phenomenon is indeed important. The second thing I wanted to say about the COVID and the shutdowns, necessary shutdowns, is that they're quite extraordinary in terms of scale. I'm about to sneeze. Please don't get worried. I'm in the British countryside and I've got hay fever. It's nothing to do with the virus. If you look at COVID, it is quite extraordinary in terms of its origins as an economic crisis. We don't normally think that health crises produce economic crises, at least not of that scale. Its breadth and depth are enormous. The last crisis, the big financial crisis, 2008, 2010, that was a crisis in the financial systems in rich countries which had knock-on effects. This one is everywhere. Its breadth is right across the world. It's truly global. And of course, the depth, the sharpness that we've seen of the fall is really unprecedented. It's peculiar in a third way in that it's simultaneously a complex demand and supply shock. So all kinds of things on the supply side have been profoundly disrupted, as well as, of course, very serious collapse in demand. And how those will interact with each other on the way out of the crisis is something we'll have to think very carefully about. Finally, it's peculiar in that it has very powerful sectoral effects, which are very different than, you know, as we all know, travel and hospitality hit particularly hard. So it has very powerful sectoral effects. And as Beata emphasized, it has very powerful distributional effects. The rich have been hit much less hard, both in terms of health and in terms of income. The young and the old have been affected in very different kinds of ways. So this is an extraordinary crisis. And as Joe emphasized, Joe Stiglitz emphasized, it's hit the poor countries particularly hard. They have seen biggest falls in remittances since records began, capital flight, falling commodity prices. Many of them who dependent on tourism have seen that collapse. And of course, we have health systems which are weak and social security systems which are weak. The position of developing countries is really desperate in many ways. And we normally in the richer countries have been very internal on this. We worry about what's going on in the UK. We worry if we're in London, what's going on in London. Perfectly understandable, but we ought to also lift our eyes to what's going on in the world. I think we'll be able to use some aspects of and think about and learn from some aspects of this crisis in constructive ways. It is unambiguously a dreadful thing, but there are some aspects of it which are positive through the experience, which we have to try to build on. The notion of wanting to build back better, the recognition there's no going back, that the old system was fragile, dangerous, inefficient, inequitable, and so on. I think we've had a recognition of community and solidarity, not everywhere, but in many places where people have been standing together, people speaking to their neighbours who didn't speak to them before. Of course, travel and communications have been transformed. We've become more efficient in some ways. We've made the most of what we found in our pantry, and we've allowed ourselves, we've managed to be a bit more creative. And of course, many of us have seen clean air. My friends in Delhi are describing what they can see and the birds that they can see. And that is something which is a very rapid experience of what less pollution might look like. And it might increase the preferences for exactly that, for less pollution, although we surely would not want to go this route in order to achieve it, because we know how to achieve it by producing and consuming in very different ways. So that's the starting point. What are the priorities now for action? Well, I think it helps to distinguish rescue, recovery, and the transformation to the zero carbon economy. Many countries still in the rescue period, some of them moving into the recovery period. During the rescue period, it's perfectly understandable that the first priority is employment. So at the moment where you're trying to preserve employment, you would not necessarily want to put heavy conditionality just in those early stages. For example, in the UK, during furlough, you wouldn't want to put conditionalities. You're just protecting jobs and incomes in the very short run to try to stop the spiral downwards being even more severe. But as you move out of that, then it comes quite quickly in terms of managing the transition out of rescue into recovery. The recovery period may take a very long time, but moving out of rescue to recovery, that process is beginning. And there it seems to me then the right kinds of investments, policies to support those investments, and finance become critical. Investments, policies to support the investments, and finance. And those are key elements in thinking through what the stimulus package should look like, what the move from rescue to recovery, and what the move through the recovery period should look like. Investments, policies, finance. Well, on the investment side, as Joe has already emphasized, fast, labor-intensive, high multipliers, strong co-benefits, for example, around pollution, and sometimes it helps if those can be socially distant activities. I'll give some examples from the work with Joe and Cameron Hepburn and Brian O'Callaghan and Dimitri Zenghelis in just a moment, and I'm sure Cameron Hepburn will come back to those. So fast, labor-intensive, high multipliers, but let's point to the co-benefits as well, and let's ask if some of them can be socially distanced. We've seen already in the outbreaks in meat factories and so on, what happens if you don't observe the social distancing at work. If we do have some things which can work that way, then good. What kind of policies? Well, in many ways, it's the usual policies around design, carbon prices and regulations. But now, in addition, and again, as Joe emphasized, we have what's sometimes called the bailout conditionalities. As the loans you've given start to come to maturity, under what circumstances do you roll them over? And under what circumstances do you change to equity? I prefer to think of that, rather than use the language bailout conditionalities, is partnerships for the future. What you're looking for is to help firms that you now have a stake in towards the technologies of the future. And that, I think, is a very big part of the story. And they, of course, will be much more secure jobs. The jobs of the 19th, 20th century technologies are not going to be stable jobs. So looking forward is very important. So sometimes we use the language conditionalities, but I think it's better to think in terms of partnership for future secure jobs that are going to go well, and changes that we have to make. Now, there are going to be quite complicated structures around finance. In the UK, we're going to have to build some kind of recovery banking system or corporation. I think we're also going to need a national infrastructure investment bank. Now, those are examples in the UK, but in many countries, we're going to have to put together very quickly financial structures that can help out. Sometimes, you know, for example, in KfW in Germany, those structures already exist. The EIB for Europe as a whole will play a strong role. But the development banks and development finance institutions are going to have to step up here, and sometimes we're going to need new structures as well. What kind of investments are necessary? Well, again, I suspect that Cameron will come back to those. Joe and I have already emphasized fast, labor intensive with high multipliers, but just to rattle through some examples, the clean physical infrastructure, like charging points for electric vehicles, broadband, making cities more friendly towards pedestrians and cycles, rooftop solar. All these, I think, examples of clean physical infrastructure, many of which can go through quickly. Retrofitting buildings can go through quickly. In many cases, we're going to have to invest in skills and education, and those labour market activities are going to be very important. Certainly in the UK, we shouldn't let anybody stay longer than a year, much less in unemployment. They should have a right to a job or right to some kind of skills acquisition training. Natural capital, very important. The tree planting, the restoration of degraded land, looking after our peatlands, looking after our water systems and so on. So much of that can be fast, labour intensive, and with strong multipliers, but also capable of being executed in ways often, not always, but often, that are socially distant. So that will be a very big part of the story as well. And we have to think in terms of our natural infrastructure, which allows, like other infrastructure, us to carry on with our consumption and production activities. A lot of innovation is going to be necessary at these times, and we'll need some R&D to keep that going. And in many areas, agricultural change, rural support will be fundamental. And it's surely time to recast the $600 or $700 billion a year that the world spends on agricultural support. The upshot is degraded land and soil mining, poisoned waters and deforestation. There's so many, we could spend the same money in very much better ways to get much more sustainable agriculture, capture carbon in the soil, have better biodiversity, and see those supports go to poorer farmers rather than richer farmers. So there's so much that we can do right across the board. I've just run through the examples. Let me close by returning to the point that Joe made on international cooperation. The world is not as cooperative as we would wish it to be, and in many ways it's become less so. In those kinds of circumstances, to find ways of doing things together, which we all recognize are of fundamental importance, seems to me to be critical, as well as, of course, tackling those problems themselves. And climate and health should surely be top of that list. We know that it can be tough to collaborate on trade. We know it can be tough to collaborate on international security. We know it can be tough to collaborate on intellectual property rights. Now, we should be collaborating on all these, but if we can find ways to collaborate around climate and health, we might be able to change the spirit towards the internationalism that we need. Globalization and internationalism are not the same thing. Globalization is in large measure about production structures and so on. Internationalism is about the way we approach problems, and we desperately need more internationalism, and working together around climate and health will be enormously important. We can work with China to help make their COP15 of the Convention on Biodiversity a success next year, just as we hope they'll help make COP26 in Glasgow a success next year. India will be president of the G20 in 2022, picking up some of those reins towards the end of next year. We can collaborate with India to make that a success around sustainable and resilient and inclusive growth. There's so much that we can do that's positive around this agenda of recovery from COVID, around the agenda of protecting health, and particularly around climate, sustainable, resilient, inclusive growth. So I hope we'll take that opportunity to promote internationalism as, of course, globalization may take another course. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. And we do have time for one quick question and quick answer. So we've received one from Bahim Adhikari in Canada. And Bahim asks, is now the time for governments to develop and promote alternative measures of progress beyond GDP, challenging the conventional measures of economic progress?
Yes, it is, but I'd like to think that in large measure we have moved there. If you think of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, they're about, of course, material well-being and hunger, but they're also about health and education and gender and forests and the functioning of cities, air pollution and so on. And they're very strongly about equity as well, the distribution of all those things. So I hope that there are fewer and fewer people stuck in the narrow prison, as it were, of just looking at GDP. If they are stuck there, we should help them out of it.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that succinct and clear answer, Nick. And it's now, we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Amar Bhattacharya. And I hope Amar from the Brookings Institution, and I hope he's going to talk about, in particular, the role of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. So, Amar, if you're available, please.
Yes, I'm around, available, and talking. So I hope everybody can hear me. So I want to build on what Nick just said and what Joe had said earlier. We have an opportunity through this coming recoveries to shape a better world. If we blow the ammunition, because it's so much of it, we will have done irreparable damage. But if we seize it, we can actually make that pathway to transformation. And what I want to do is focus very much on the how, and particularly the role of policymakers and finance ministers at this crucial juncture, building on work, based on work that I've been doing with Nick and with James Ridge and Dimitri, but also a larger coalition of both the Coalition of Finance Ministers, but also its institutional partners. So as Nick said, there are really three elements that are crucial: having the right investments, having the supportive policies, and tackling the difficult challenges around debt and finance. And I want to focus a little bit more in detail on those three elements. So on the investments, what is clear is, as the work of Vivid Economics shows, that the first wave of packages that we have had so far really have not been very green. Indeed, they have been mainly, investments of the old kind. And as Nick pointed out, that is understandable because the focus was really on protecting lives and livelihoods. But we also have to ensure that we are not doing any harm. And there, the recovery packages that will be designed now have to ensure that they are setting this path, which is, as Nick said, as Joe said, it has to be fast, it has to be labor intensive, it has to have strong multipliers, but those multipliers also must have important co-benefits, including on climate. It appears so far that the gold standard for this is very much the EU Green Deal. And the advantage of the EU Green Deal was it was there already before COVID came along. So there was a ready-made plan, there was a roadmap, and there was the mechanisms to support it, including the European Investment Bank. The rest of the world does not have that. So a very important task for the rest of the world right now is how to get shovel-ready investments that have a long-term vision and a long-term purpose that can populate the green recovery packages. And that's the task that countries face. And this challenge is particularly a challenge for emerging markets and developing countries. So there are a number of lenses that one can use to help assess green recovery packages. One is the OECD lens. It's the well-being lens, as the OECD calls it. And the well-being lens allows us to look at green, but much more than green. It allows us to look at what is the impact of the recovery in terms of the larger well-being, including in terms of social inclusion, in terms of cohesion, and in terms of welfare. The second instrument that we have that is kind of powerful is green budgeting. Is the recovery packages meet a test that they actually are consistent with principles of green budgeting? France, the UK to some extent have been applying this, but we can boil that down and we can apply green budgeting as an instrument to assess are the recovery packages sound. The World Bank has been developing project level guidance and checklists that will be valuable in making sure that the investments are doing no harm, but also that the investment meet the criteria at the project level that we would like to aspire to. Sector guidance is extremely important because ultimately it's not one project at a time. We are trying to bring about system change in energy, in mobility. And so it's very important to think about sector-based guidance that can be used to try and assess these packages. And finally, it's extremely important that as we look at green recovery, we focus on resilience. Resilience was a big shortcoming before COVID, and it has to be of central importance as we go beyond COVID. So all of these can help us in thinking about better recovery, and there's much to be learned from the cross-country experience. I mean, a good example I heard about today at some great depth is what Milan, for example, is doing as a city to try and respond to the crisis by bringing in a whole-of-city approach, by focusing on sustainable mobility and looking at opportunities for green investments post-COVID. As Nick also mentioned, it's extremely important to have a supportive policy framework. We have to think about carbon pricing opportunistically because of the very low energy prices that we have right now. But it also is a way to think beyond carbon pricing, to think about smarter regulations and standards. For example, the synergy between regulations to lock in the reductions in air pollution that we have had, building and efficiency standards, city design, energy efficiency. This is a great time to think about smart regulations. And the third part, which I won't dwell on, is bailout conditionalities, particularly as we move from rescue to recovery. The last part I want to spend a little bit more time on is finance. So we know that two things that are coming out of COVID. One is because of the tremendous requirements around rescue, balance sheets will be tremendously stretched, especially public balance sheets coming out of the COVID response. The second thing we know is what Nick had pointed out, which is the scale of investment and the scale of finance, will be huge, not only to deal with recovery, but with need to respond to the transformation for four essential reasons. First, we know that if we are to meet the climate goals, we have to transform the existing capital stock. The existing capital stock is not consistent with the 1.5 degree target. It's not consistent with climate resilience. So there is a huge task of replacing aging and polluting capital with better capital. And more, therein lies an opportunity, but the answer means more investment, more innovation. Second, we know that the capital stock on infrastructure particularly will need to double in the next 15 years to respond to the requirements of emerging markets and developing countries and structural change in those countries, especially urbanization. Third, we have to be able to make the capital stock more resilient. That will also require increases in investment. And last but not least, we have to invest in rather than degrade natural capital. All of this means that beyond the recovery, we are looking for a period of 2 decades or so where investment requirements will be upwards of 2 to 3 percentage points, and we have to be able to find a way to finance that. Now, we know that public balance sheets will be stretched. We also know that private capital opportunities are large, but the challenge will be around debt and risk aversion. The interest rates in advanced countries, in the post-COVID world, will be negative real interest rates. We know that there will be huge opportunities in emerging markets and developing countries, but risk premium will be high. So there will be tremendous payoff in terms of risk mitigation and channeling finance to emerging markets and developing countries. That is where development finance institutions come in a big way. The multilateral development banks are planning to invest roughly about 160 billion in the next 18 months or so. Absolutely essential for the rescue and putting the seeds of recovery. But as I was arguing, we will need to sustain that. And in order to do that, it will be very important to grow the multilateral development finance system, and especially the MDBs. And the time to think about that is now, not 18 months from now. So in terms of the mobilization agenda, we will need a renewed kind of public and private partnership around sustainable infrastructure, in which the role of the multilateral development and the development finance institutions, such as CDC, which Amal-Lee will be representing, will have an extremely important role to play. But the last part is to also transform the whole of finance so that finance is able to respond to climate risk, but is also able to drive the low carbon transition. This is something that Markani has been very focused on, the importance here of getting financial institutions to be part of the agenda of transformation. So let me end there. And I think just to stress that ambition, no going back, urgency of response, and getting the whole of finance to work for this transformation are the challenges that finance ministers have to focus on together with other policymakers in a whole of government approach.
Thank you very much indeed, Amar. That's excellent. We have time for one very quick question and answer, and it really is picking up on your final point. Bahim Madikari sent us a second question, which is asking about the difficulties of getting finance ministries engaged with the discussion about climate policy, which has traditionally been under the under the guidance of the Ministries of Environment and Climate Change. So do you have any, do you think that the pandemic presents, is going to make it more difficult to get the finance ministries engaged, or will they see this as an opportunity?
Well, we have the coalition of finance ministers on climate action that was launched exactly about a year ago, and with a recognition that climate action, required strong involvement of finance ministers. So at least 55 finance ministers have already signed on to that commitment. But I would also argue that there, through the work that, we have been helping the coalition with, there is a strong recognition of the twin crises. That we have a pandemic crisis that needs to be responded to right away, but the climate crisis is ever present. And that the path to responding to the climate crisis is really through shaping this better recovery. And both the recovery and the transformation requires investments of the right kind, it requires policies of the right kind, and it requires finance at scale of the right kind. And finance ministers have an absolutely central role in driving this agenda. Will they be distracted by the pandemic? Yes, but there is a recognition, I think, everywhere that people have to start thinking about comprehensive and stimulus packages that are green. They ensure that we don't go back, and that set a path to long-term transformation. Finance ministers are only beginning to fully grasp this. I think that's fair, but the whole of government needs to come together, and finance ministers can be the glue that can drive that agenda.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Amar, for that. And it's now time for us to move on to our panel. We are very lucky to have 4 distinguished panelists. What's going to happen is that they are each going to make some initial 5-minute remarks, and then we'll move to open questions before we move to the ministerial keynote. So I'm going to ask them in this order. We're going to start with Amal-Lee Amin, who is the Climate Change Director at the CDC Group. Then we're going to have Helen Mountford, who's Vice President for Climate Change and Economics at the World Resources Institute in Washington. We will then have Dimitri Zenghelis, who's a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE and is also at Cambridge University. And then we're going to have Professor Cameron Hepburn, the Director of the Smith School at Oxford University, who's co-hosting this event. So Amal-Lee, I'm going to ask you, Amar, you can turn your video off as well, I think. And then Amal-Lee, you turn your video on and unmute yourself.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Bob, and everyone for the invitation to participate in this discussion. It's extremely timely, the discussion we're having now. I think, as everyone has said, this really is a once in a century opportunity to really reset and redesign this next phase of growth that is consistent with where we need to be in terms of delivering net zero emissions by 2050, ensuring we are resilient to physical impacts of climate change, as well as other economic shocks, such as this pandemic has shown. And of course, to also ensure much greater inclusivity in our future growth trajectory. So it's it's great to be able to hear the great words that Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern, Amar have said, and I couldn't agree more in the need to really focus on this new economic paradigm and to seize the opportunity in a way that governments have to lead. And I think, as Amar said, the Ministries of Finance Coalition is a really valuable venue to be able to build a much more collaborative approach for peers to come together and talk through some of the ways in which they can really build that better. In fact, I've been in a number of discussions this week on this topic, including one with Helen yesterday. And, you know, there is a huge potential for particularly the 160 billion that Amar referred to, that the MDBs will likely be providing, a lot of which will probably go as counter-cyclical measures, so fast dispersing budgetary support. But alongside the finance will come technical support, mostly, as well as some elements of institutional reform. These policy-based measures are really about reforming policies. And so the issue here is the extent to which some of those measures are shovel-ready policies, because I think, and I know Nick and Amar, you wrote a great paper on that, where, you know, these shovel-ready policies can really make some of those changes to the regulatory, economic and other institutional contexts that really will provide the transformation that will be needed over time, and critically incentivize private sector investment. So as CDC, we're an impact investor, Development Finance Institute, the UK's DFI, and we will be first back into our markets where, you know, we will be working, well, we're already working with our investees to ensure that they are able to stay afloat during these very, very difficult times. But as we look to rebuild, it will be essential that those signals, the public sector signals that will be needed to drive their private investment for building back better, that those start to come through. And so the role of governments is obviously critical. The role of the multilateral development banks will be, you know, very important in that respect. But the time really is of the essence here as well, because many of those policy-based loans will likely be designed in the coming months. So I think a key issue that I'd just like to, you know, flag that Amar referred to, he talked about the sustainable infrastructure agenda. The MDBs have been collaborating around some common standards around sustainable infrastructure. And, you know, now really is the time to start to integrate those into the policy-based responses, to integrate those in upstream into the government policy regulatory frameworks, to start to provide the right private incentives for the private sector to actually invest in sustainable infrastructure, sustainable in low carbon, resilience, but also in terms of good jobs and local jobs, very, very, very importantly. And I do think, I mean, the need for the new public-private partnerships is absolutely essential in that respect. And, you know, thankfully, there's been, again, this week, in fact, a number of conversations I've been involved in talking about exactly that. What kind of public-private partnerships can we establish now, particularly to mobilize private capital into emerging and developing economies to really ensure this next phase is about building that better.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Amal-Lee. We're going to move straight on to the next panelist, and Amal-Lee will be responding to questions in the panel discussion after these introductory remarks. But I'm going to ask Helen Mountford next to make her opening remarks. Helen, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Bob, and thank you very much for this excellent discussion today. It's been great hearing the other speakers so far. And I think as many have said, I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic is absolutely devastating, and we're seeing the shockwaves around the world, and these will continue. But it also does provide truly a once-in-a-century moment when we can reset our economies and move towards something which is much more inclusive, low carbon, and resilient growth paths. We're already seeing unprecedented investments coming forward, something like $10 trillion so far in addressing COVID-19 and rebuilding. What we want to look at is how do we do this in a way that we can build back better? And so what I'd love to do today is just emphasize three broad areas in which governments can invest now and to support a job-driven recovery to the COVID-19 crisis, and that will help us to build back better, to be more inclusive, to be low carbon, more sustainable, and much more resilient to future shocks. So one of the things that both Joe and Nick stressed very strongly is the importance of investing in the economy of the future, the jobs of the future, not the old, polluting, inefficient economy. That's absolutely essential. And in many cases, what we've actually seen is these can also deliver what we need now in the short term in terms of jobs and income, for example, and in some cases better than the old economy. So we need to bring that to the front, particularly as we see in some countries an emphasis on shifting back to where there were shovel-ready projects, for example, in coal, which were shelved 2 or 3 years ago. Well, they were shelved for good reasons. And now we need to look at what we can get from alternatives to those. What are the projects that can really help to deliver the economy of the future? So let me emphasize just 3 areas in terms of the investments which really can deliver the jobs that we need. So first is broadly and sustainable infrastructure projects, including public transport. So we did see, following the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the US stimulus in a number of states, US states spent money on public transit. And what we found looking back across these was that for those states that focused on public transport, they actually generated about 70% more job hours for each dollar that was spent than those that focused instead on highways. Now, unfortunately, not knowing this and given some of the political economy at the time, the majority of states focused their transport-related spending on public, not on public, but on the highways. So they mainly focused on highways, but those who actually focused on public transit generated more job hours than the others. And again, that is investment that goes across the country and across the region. Of course, public transit, including walking and cycling, also provides more equitable access to jobs, education, and service. So that's really essential as we move towards a more inclusive economy. The second investment area is another area of infrastructure, but focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency. And again, we've seen that this can generate more jobs per dollar spent than, for example, fossil fuel expenditures. So renewable energy and energy efficiency in the electricity sector are much more labor intensive generally than fossil fuels in the short term, and so can create more jobs and increase short-term GDP. So there's been research which shows that renewable energy and energy efficiency investments can create over twice as many jobs, gross jobs, as coal and gas investments per dollar spent. And this was echoed in the recent IEA report, where they proposed a 3-year sustainable recovery plan coming out of COVID-19, focused on the energy sector, which would save or create roughly 9 million jobs a year over the next 3 years. That compares with the something like 6 million jobs in energy and related sectors that have been lost due to COVID-19 impacts or are thought to be at risk at the moment. So really, this sustainable recovery plan that IEA put forward would generate significant jobs, more than what we're expecting to lose in the sector at the moment. And some of the largest amounts of new jobs would really be in retrofitting buildings, a critical area to look at, and other measures that really focus on improving energy efficiency. The third broad area of investment I want to focus on is nature-based solutions. Right? These can help to stimulate jobs, but also reduce the climate and ecological risks, including triggers for future pandemics, an issue that Nick raised earlier that's absolutely critical to ensure our resilience in the future to these risks. So again, we saw in the 2008-2009 recession, there were a number of stimulus packages, stimulus projects in the US towards nature-based solutions, including $167 million to restore coastal habitats. These kinds of nature-based solutions are estimated to create, on average, something like 40 jobs for every $1 million spent, which is, again, much more than what we see in the traditional fossil fuel industries, potentially as much as 5 times the rate that you would see in fossil fuels. So the nature-based solutions can also help to deliver jobs, and again, across the country, and particularly in rural landscapes around the world where we need jobs and income so badly. Now, to complement these investments, governments do need to implement policies that will help to lock in the benefits over the long term. It's not just this initial investment and expenditure, it's also the policies for the longer term framework. I won't go into detail now because of time, but happy to discuss further. As Amar and Nick said, I think this strongly includes issues like reforming distorting subsidies, whether those are to fossil fuels or to agriculture or to water usage. It includes carbon pricing, and it includes disclosure of climate-related financial risks, helping us to avoid some of the future shocks and crises. Now, we've got important examples that have been emerging around the world on how we can do subsidy reform and carbon pricing right in a way which actually is inclusive. It helps support low-income and middle-income households, does not put jobs at risk. And for those where we do see sectors which are declining, it helps to make sure there's a just transition to ensure that workers and communities are protected and supported through that transition to the jobs and to the economy of the future. So we have a lot of the solutions. We need to make sure those are included immediately as countries are starting to recover from the COVID-19 shock, as they start to put in place the policies. Now is the moment that we can really build back better and do it in a way which actually generates more jobs, better jobs across the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen, for that upbeat assessment. We're going to move on now to Dimitri Zenghelis, who is a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE, and he's also works at the Bennett Institute at University of Cambridge. So, Dimitri, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you for allowing me to speak amongst such a distinguished group. I think the thoughts that I will add to this conversation are the pretty obvious ones that fall out of what's been said already, which is the centrality of growth to get out of this downturn, this unprecedented downturn. And that can be demonstrated, if you like, through the prism of debt to GDP, where history shows the futility of trying to get out of a debt to GDP, public debt to GDP problem by trying to prematurely balance budgets. And the reason is very simply that it's very simple. GDP is both in the numerator. So if you undermine GDP, it's harder to have sustainable debt to GDP, but of course it's also in the it's in the denominator, but it's also in the numerator because your ability to bring down public debt is a function of generating the growth that induces net public revenues. So GDP is central, as history has shown, and a central corollary of that is the importance of confidence and expectations and the role of the public sector in steering those. There's been a lot of FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, being invoked, including in the Prime Minister's recent speech of late. And that's for a good reason. It's because economic evidence strongly suggests that pulling the world out of recession and generating the kind of sustainable, inclusive, and resilient growth path that we require does require framing a vision of the benefits of government action. A lot of the sectors we're talking about, energy, transport, buildings, planning, they're very policy driven, they're highly regulated sectors. So a clear, credible vision is necessary to give confidence to investors and also to businesses and consumers in order to steer a sustainable recovery. So I'm going to just sort of quickly outline two strategic complementarity problems with inferior Nash equilibria for which strong policy action is required. And I'll explain what that kind of economicsy jargon actually means. But they apply both in the short run and in the long run. In the short run, we've got the kind of classic Keynesian paradox of thrift, where fear of a downturn leads businesses to cut investment and shed workers, banks to retrench on credit, and consumers to stop spending. Well, of course, when everybody responds in this way, expectations become self-fulfilling in generating the very downturn that agents were worried about. So the primary macroeconomic task for policymakers is to offset this effect and stimulate private spending, lending, and hiring in the short run to avoid the risk of a protracted depression in the next few years. The other element, of course, and this is why we've talked in our paper with Joe and Nick and Cam and others about short and long run multipliers, is the fact that we actually want to, if we have the opportunity to invest without crowding anything out, as we do at the present time on unemployed resources, that we want to expand capacity in the long run. We want to invest in complementary long run assets. And against this framing, as Joe and Nick and others have already said, sustainable, resilient, inclusive investments have some very appealing short and long run characteristics. In the short run, as Joe said, clean energy investment, things like insulation retrofits, building wind turbines, broadband networks, planting trees and restoring wetlands. They tend to be pretty labor intensive. They can be done quickly. They're not susceptible to offshoring or imports. And so they have high short-run multipliers. In the long run, multipliers also turn out to be high because the operation and maintenance of more productive, renewable and energy efficiency technologies makes them less labor intensive in the long run, and energy cost savings are passed on to the wider economy. You also generate a lot of innovation. Innovation not just within sectors, we've seen that with the 80% plus declines in the cost of things like solar PV and battery technologies, but also spillovers into other parts of the non-green economy. And the sheer scale of the low carbon transition means that some of these network effects and economies of scale in production and discovery are just so large that we invariably tend to underpredict both the scope and the speed of productivity augmenting clean innovation when it actually happens. And then finally, there's the kind of co-benefits and opportunities that are associated with a low carbon transition, the kinds of stuff that Helen and Nick and I have talked about before in the new climate economy to do with resource efficient growth, including really non-trivial benefits such as health benefits from tackling pollution, time wasted in congestion, inefficiency, and so on. So once you factor all these into the long-term growth picture, then that becomes a very kind of strong and compelling story. But then there's a second strategic complementarity problem. This is the long run one, which I alluded to at the outset. And here too, credible policy intervention can help guide actions and investor expectations and steer technology shifts to new networks. And it's important here because this is about overcoming some of the sort of inertia and switching costs that make it quite difficult to shift innovation from dirty to clean technology networks, because we tend to like to do things the way we've always done them in the past, and familiar, known processes and technologies tend to be favored. And that's very obvious when you think about the standpoint of a mayor or a politician or a business person seeking to invest in low carbon renewable technologies. If you think no one else is going to do it, then the cost of the technology will be high, the finance will be niche, and you won't get growing new markets if you want to fabricate and export the stuff. However, if you think everybody's about to invest, then you'll probably see it in your competitive interest to actually make that investment as well. And of course, if everybody acts in the same way, by investing, it brings down the cost, it changes the politics and the economics of the low carbon transition, and very quickly it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, like we've seen, as I've said already, in things like renewable energy, and we're seeing in electric vehicles. And I'm hoping that Cam, who's about to speak in a moment, will actually show a picture of the one of the outcomes of the study that we undertook, which surveyed about 230 finance ministry, central bank officials, senior economists, not the usual environmental suspects, but people in positions of great influence, who showed that they thought some of the highest impact, highest multiplier investments in many cases were clean investment, clean R&D, clean energy infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure, buildings upgrades, and energy efficiency, and even investment in green space. And to me, that says with just a little bit of leadership, we could very possibly be on the brink of an expectations augmented tipping point to a more resilient, sustainable, and fairer post-COVID world that will both radically change the policy landscape, but also radically change the investment and asset management landscape as well. But it does require that leadership from government and businesses, and post-COVID, I think, is a very good time for us to see it.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Dimitri. We're going to move very quickly on to Professor Cameron Hepburn for the final set of initial comments from the panel. Remember, if you want to ask a question of the panel, you must email me on gri.policy@lse.ac.uk. But over to Cameron.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks to you personally and the LSE for taking a lead in pulling this webinar together and making it reality. And thanks actually to my colleague Ben Caldecott at Oxford for the initial idea. So I've enjoyed listening to all of the comments so far, and I think if you were to sum them all up, you'd have to say that the intellectual arguments for a sustainable recovery are pretty compelling, and they are. I mean, whether it's business leaders or NGO or government around the world or the IEA or our work, I mean, it's all pressing the same direction. And for those who haven't read the paper Dimitri referred to just now, I'm going to stick it in the chat. And because he's asked me, I hadn't planned on doing this, but let me show you the slide that I think Dimitri wanted me to share. This is a plot of the response to our survey of 231 officials, economists and officials in finance ministries and central banks as to what their preferred climate-friendly, fast and policies with high multipliers would be. And you can see the ones in the blue heavy shaded outline are sensible green recovery sort of policies. So I could spend an hour talking about that, but I won't, because I got 4 more minutes. What I actually wanted to do, given where the discussion thus far has gone, is to ask ourselves the question, given just how powerful these intellectual arguments are for a sustainable recovery, why aren't we seeing more of it just yet? Now, it's perhaps too early to say, and there are some very promising signs, and we have been tracking and reviewing the different policies as they emerge, and there are some promising signs, whether it's the German announcement or the EU one, but there are some concerning areas as well. And so I actually want to go into the how do we make this a reality? And if it isn't going to happen this time around, and as Amar said, we don't really have the luxury of it not happening, because we've already built the capital stock that will take us over 1.5 degrees of warming and probably over 2 as well. So how can we make sure this happens? So a first kind of explanation for why maybe it isn't happening as fast as it might be is the politics. It's normally one of these explanations, and people just don't get it. They're not in favor of it. They don't really like green things, or it's only niche. Now, it turns out this isn't the reason. If you have a look around the world at the percentage of people in favor of a green recovery, and Ipsos Mori did this polling a couple of months ago. In the US, you've got a majority. 57% of people are in favor of a green recovery. If you go to China, it's 80% in favor, and in India, 81%. So it's not general public opinion that is holding us back, potentially. Is it the firepower that's holding us back? Well, as several of speakers today have said, well, we've already blown 10 trillion, not blown, I mean sensibly invested 10 trillion in keeping businesses afloat and people alive. And we'll probably do something like that again on the recovery. So the fiscal space in aggregate sense isn't a problem, but actually in some countries it is an issue. And I think this is at the heart of the answer to this question, why aren't we seeing more? The heart of it is distributional issues. And so one reason is fiscal space is different across different countries. Some have the space to do an enormous amount of action, others perceive themselves or actually don't have the space for a strong green stimulus and green recovery. And so I think that's part of the answer. I'll get on to the other part, but before I move on to the other part, what can we do? What is the response if countries are in that situation? And this goes back to something Dimitri just really said. This is a confidence game. This is about setting clarity of direction of travel. It's about signaling to investors, whether domestic or international, where the returns are going to be, where the money should flow, and hence where the jobs will be created. And you can do that without necessarily spending government money. It helps, obviously, enormously for the government to have skin in the game, as it were. But whether it's policies like auctioned feed-in tariffs or CFDs that have worked so well in other contexts, or there's a range of regulatory interventions that can just send a very strong signal that this is where the recovery is going. Put your capital here and you'll make a return. So just because your country doesn't have the fiscal capability to spend $1 trillion on this or even several hundred billion doesn't mean there's nothing that you can do. So that's one part of the story, I think. The other part is also, as I alluded to, about distribution. And it's the politics of the winners and the losers and the necessity of emphasizing the just transition here. So if we look at China, where there's a huge sense in a huge battle for on this issue going on now, and I've been up early on calls with China Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday morning this week. And if this argument is lost, which it may well be, we will see, it's in the balance, but if it's lost, it'll be because there are regions and provinces of China who stand to lose an awful lot because they're very coal capture, would be one way of putting it, but just coal intensive. Their livelihoods rest on coal, and they have political power, and that's part of the politics of every nation. It's not specific to China. And I think we are increasingly recognizing, Joe referred to inequality here, as have others, but the necessity of properly thinking through the just transition here is absolutely vital to getting all of the arguments that Helen made, that we've made in our paper, that Beata made about the quick wins. To deliver all of that really requires assuaging the concerns of the minorities, but who nonetheless are influential for good reason, who don't want to see this change. And it's not just the minorities in labor, it's the minorities in the capital holding as well. So let me sum up there. It's not the intervention I'd intended to make today, but following the discussions that I heard, I think it's the right one. And I think if we're to turn these ideas into reality, it requires this focus on what you do if you don't have fiscal space on the one hand, and then how you manage the potential losers, because they don't actually need to be losers, on the other hand. And if we can do that sensibly, then we can get the politics right, then the obvious economic rationality of a green recovery. I mean, it is mind-numbingly stupid to do anything else. This is a slam dunk of the greatest proportion, but we need to make it happen, and that rests on getting these other things right. So let me close down there.
Thank you very much, Cameron, and thank you for using the phrase slam dunk in the middle of a discussion about the economics of recovery. So excellent. We're going to move straight on to questions which have been sent in. And what I'm going to do is direct them to a particular member of the panel for us to answer. And if anybody else from the panel wants to join in, please let me know. But there's no expectation that every panelist has to answer every question. We've got a few questions we can go through. So I'm going to start with a question that's come in. Start with a question for Amal-Lee, and it's a question from Lawrence Wainwright, who in Sweden, who has asked, what style of leadership and management do we need to build back better? What types of behaviors, traits, and temperaments must underpin such a style? So Amal-Lee, do you want to have a go at that first?
Wow, interesting question. I mean, we definitely need bold and courageous leadership right now. I mean, Cameron just said it should be a slam dunk if we get the politics right, but we need to get the politics right. And we know there are many political economy issues that will be pushing back against a Build Back Better agenda. And so political leaders need to be, recognizing the interests of their citizens, both current citizens as well as future generations. And I think, ultimately that's what leaders need to be recognizing now. I think the COVID crisis, whilst, it's exposed a lot of interesting elements around leadership, I would say. And at the same time, I think, one of the interesting aspects of this, it's showed that we are, as humans, we're quite vulnerable collectively. And, we're lucky and fortunate to inhabit such a beautiful planet. And those leaders that, really embrace that and that collective will, I would say, to ensure that we really do maintain our ability to thrive on this planet, I think it is what will be needed now.
Thank you very much, Amal-Lee. Anyone else from the panel that you should start talking if you want to comment?
Bob, it's Helen here. I might just add briefly, I think Amal-Lee is absolutely right. I do think one of the things we're looking for in leaders are those who can recognize, as Cameron said, recognize where there could be potential losers, or there could be those who would have strong special interests and are able to work with them to find solutions which actually represent a Build Back Better, a better pathway, rather than just giving into some of the immediate concerns. And just two very quick examples of what we're actually seeing on the ground now where we've seen this. Germany's come forward just now with a stimulus package that is very strongly green. They have a car industry which is very powerful and quite traditional. And yet they've actually managed to resist pressures to subsidize the traditional internal combustion engine vehicles and instead focused on electric vehicles. But they've done that through a dialogue and discussion with the car industry. So have gone in a very strong green direction, resisting some of those pressures. Another one is Canada, where for some of the bailouts of companies, they have said, well, you know, we're going to be doing this. We recognize this is important, but as part of this, you need to start disclosing in future your climate related risks. And so that we are able to know as investors, as shareholders, where those are and actually move towards economies which are going to be less at risk for these kind of systemic risks. So I think there's approaches there. We're starting to see some real leadership, certainly in a number of countries and regions. But part of that is going to be able to have some of those hard dialogues, acknowledge where there are challenges, but move through them rather than just sort of giving in at the first hurdle.
Thank you very much, Helen. We're rapidly approaching the time when we'll ask Jesse Norman to speak, but I just want to get two quick questions in, one for Dimitri and one for Cameron. So very quick questions and very quick answers here. First of all, Dimitri, which sectors in the should the UK economic recovery package be aiming at? And do you think there's a problem with, in the words of Dominic Cummings allegedly this week, investing in boring old insulation? And then for Cameron, economic growth is still largely a function of increased consumption. So how do we find radically different policy objective from that of growth to guide human society? So very quickly, Dimitri and then Cameron on those two questions.
Short answer, yes, energy efficiency, massively important. The IEA put out their green stimulus, or their low carbon energy stimulus program, and I think about 40% of the investments that they recommend can be broadly categorized as energy efficiency. So that's a key and crucial and obvious place to start, because it yields short-run benefits of the kind we've spoken about and long-run benefits as well. And on top of that, you want to roll out new networks on broadband. So you've got the sort of smart connectivity story, electric vehicle charging, and then infrastructure as well. But a lot of this is also about institutions, building a new national investment bank. We mentioned this in the UK context, but there's all sorts of institutional change and industrial strategy changes that are necessary to provide that clear signal to deliver the slam dunk that Cam spoke about.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dimitri. Over to you, Cameron. Do we need a radically different objective other than economic growth to guide us?
No. I was tempted to leave it there, but Nick made the point that we have the SDGs. They're a great dashboard of indicators of economic progress. There are some other measures kicking around too. Well, certainly, I'm not sure I asked the question, but what we don't want is a consumption binge. I mean, if you're going to take on an awful lot of debt, what you have to do is add assets to the other side of the ledger. And if you do that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with more debt. I mean, if you've got lots of assets to counterbalance the debt, I mean, go for your life, borrow. If it's producing valuable returns, then the more you borrow, the better off everybody is. But if you're borrowing for a consumption binge, then you're in big trouble. But going back to the indicators, if it's not the SDGs, if that's too many, 17 and 169, then my preference is for a measure of national wealth that captures these capital stocks on the balance sheet. And let's remember that the capitals that we're investing in here is not just physical capital, it's human capital first and foremost, and natural capital as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Cameron, and thank you to all the panelists for being very succinct and making up for the time we lost at the start. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, the Right Honourable Jessie Norman MP. Minister, are you there?
Hold on a second.
Perfect. Very good. Over to you, Minister.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And can I also thank Ben Caldecott and hi, Nick, and hello, Joe. And what a pleasure it is to have a chance to talk to everyone today. I'm sorry I would have been on for the entire session, but I've been taking the finance bill, which is the piece of legislation that encodes the budget into law through the House of Commons. So I had to delay and dash out in order to catch this part. And thank you so much. So I come to this with a triple interest. I'm not speaking as a Treasury Minister, if I may, because that will create all kinds of potential difficulty. But I am speaking as a policy wonk and someone who has in the past been a roads and cycling and walking minister and also an energy minister. So I have a certain policy background that may be relevant to this discussion. I think it might be helpful if I just start by just rehearsing a few things that I think we all know, but perhaps have been brought home to us by the present pandemic. So one of them is that there's a great deal of potential opportunity here, as well as the extreme difficulty of having to deal with the economic and of course also the social shock of COVID-19. The second is that, as everyone will have seen, in many, many respects, this is potentially a highly regressive development, and we have to be very careful within the political world to understand that. And that in itself creates dilemmas and challenges, because of course we're trying to mitigate some of those regressive effects, or indeed all those regressive effects if we can, but also to blend that with the achievement of a wider set of economic and indeed, of course, sustainability goals. The third is, and I think, I hope you don't mind saying, I think it's also completely obvious that growth is not all growth is homogenous. There is sustainable, resilient growth, and there is growth, as has already been mentioned, I think by Cameron, built on unsustainable grounds. An example of that would be a consumption binge of the kind. On the other hand, consumption has taken such a hit in the last few weeks that a little more consumption might be a rather useful way of helping us to tide over the current situation. A fourth point would be that what's really going to make a big difference is what you might call norm change, expectations change, that's been touched on, as well as policy change. And I think that's really important, because that is what frames the political context and therefore the option space within which policies become genuinely available. And then the final point is terribly simple, but we simply don't know what the shape of the recovery is yet. You may have seen that even the Bank of England, I mean, Andy Haldane is no one's example of a conventional thinker, and he proved that again by suggesting we might have much more of a V-shaped recovery than certainly many commentators have been expecting. So we just don't know quite in the heat of things in this country yet where we are, and therefore the question of what fiscal stimulus in the shorter run should be undertaken and the timing and phasing of that becomes extremely pertinent. I greatly enjoyed what I've read so far of the Smith School paper that you've all been involved in. I think that's been a brilliant launching off point. And I don't think there's anyone in this country who would demur in principle from the importance of clean infrastructure, retrofitting, education, training, natural capital investment, and clean R&D. And I would not be doing my job if I didn't draw your attention to the extraordinary project we've got in my own city of Hereford, which is the new model in technology and engineering, where we're trying to create a new university on completely radically different basis from the ways in which they've been constructed in this country, dedicated to technology and engineering, and very, very heavily focused on sustainability. It's also the only university I know which has both a vice chancellor and a chairman who are female. So that's, and indeed 50-50 all the way down, and that will be getting up and running in the next few months. And I think that's going to be the kind of radical, innovative thinking at an institutional level we're going to need if we're going to bring and breed the next generation of entrepreneurs and technologists forward. I do think one great competitive strength of this country, and I'm partly responsible for it in my ministerial capacity, is the institutional framework we bring to it. And of course, we have the Climate Change Committee, which you will all be familiar with, which I think is a very, very important institution in its own right. But of course, on the infrastructure side, we have the National Infrastructure Commission. We have the structure of assessments, national infrastructure assessments, which need to be met by an infrastructure strategy, and we will be hoping to publish that infrastructure strategy later this year. And we have, of course, also, we have just created a new office for, as it were, keeping everyone in government honest on issues of agricultural sustainability in the agriculture bill. That's very important. Clean air, clean water, biodiversity. And we also have the Infrastructure Projects Authority, which is all about trying to make sure that these infrastructural projects actually deliver on the goals that have been set for them. And therefore, if they have, as every infrastructure project must these days have, high expectations about sustainability of the project itself, as well as of its final achievement and functioning and operating, then the IPA is designed to keep that process effective and honest. So let's just, if I may, I'll just touch on a couple of things. One is what you might call interventions, and the second is resilience. I think on the intervention side, well, you'll have seen the sweep of things that we have launched from the Treasury in the past few months by way of policy to protect people and jobs and businesses. And I think that's been, I mean, it's been very widely welcomed, but in a way that isn't so surprising, because it's involved the spending of an enormous amount of public money in an effort to keep commercial society in this country and businesses and employment up and running. But also, I think there is a wider strand of intervention that we could unleash in a green spirit. I as a former cycling and walking minister, I'm always amazed by how little attention that gets. I'm pleased to say we've been kind of correcting that over the last few years, but you know, the benefit cost ratios for these schemes are 7 to 10 times historically, and that's a lot better, I can tell you, than most other schemes that government ever sees. If you look at what we're doing, for example, in supporting big cities, Manchester is an example where we spent an enormous amount of public money supporting a step change, what we hope will be a step change in transport towards a much greener cycling and walking urban environment. So there are specific sets of interventions that need to be built on, and in the metaphorical sense, in order for it to make a genuinely sustainable recovery. But there's also, I think, a much deeper issue, which is the extent to which we can embed the concept of resilience into our expectations and policy. And I think of this particularly in the context of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. I'm responsible for HMRC within government with my ministerial hat on. And that institution is having to evolve incredibly quickly, not just in terms of the different policies that have been made, but also in terms of its own self-image. It's becoming more of a national recovery and resilience organization, as well as a taxing authority. And I think that's a very important potential evolution, and it's one that we're looking very closely at from within government. Let me say a couple of other quick things about the politics of it, because I suspect that's the area which so much of our future thinking will have to revolve around. One is, I don't think that it ever helps in these contexts to adopt an oppositional or denunciatory mode of approach to politics. I am probably the least partisan person in the House of Commons, and I've always found that was a much better way of getting on. And I think everyone, as has been touched on earlier, rightly, gets the importance of a genuine shift in our entire policy framework towards greater sustainability. And that's why, of course, we've committed ourselves in statute to become the first to net zero country by 2050. And of course, we can argue about whether that's ambitious enough, but that is there. Now, I don't think oppositional, as it were, denunciation is, although it's so popular at the moment and so easily fed by social media, is a particularly smart way to proceed. And the reason for that is because all policy has multiple objectives. And if you pretend it doesn't have multiple objectives, then you're probably ignoring just the conflicts between equity in one policy, between one set of, as it were, potential groups of people, let alone the conflict that can exist between different sets of interests in and around the environmental versus the for example, the strictly economic and other areas. And of course, those two well, in many people's thinking, should amount to the same thing over time. And after all, oikonomia, household management, is a fundamentally ecological idea. But in the short run, you are going to get these trade-offs. I think the other thing is that these trade-offs often have the character of good versus good, and those make them genuinely hard problems and difficult, intractable political problems. The other thing I'd say is, in a way, I put down a slight challenge to everyone who's on this group, which is I do think there's a big disconnect between academic opinion, political opinion, and a popular opinion. And I would encourage you, if you're running Ipsos Mori surveys, to survey all those three things, because that is what's going to define the political space. And it's terribly easy, I think, from an academic standpoint, to say, well, of course, we're all good Keynesians now, and government should be spending a heck of a lot more. But that doesn't wrestle with anything like the concerns that a government is going to be facing, which might, for example, have to think about whether or not there will be a second wave, whether we have to do it all over again, whether or not we can genuinely reset the national debt of this country from 40% to 80% to 110% and not feel any problem because of the low interest rate environment we happen currently to be in. And I listened several years ago, I think probably 7 or 8 years ago, I probably the first article in a national newspaper by a politician calling for a national assets fund of the kind that would precisely allow the disclosure of assets alongside the disclosure of debt in order to address the issue that Carol was just touching on. So believe me, I am sensitive to these points, but they do create difficult political incentives. And if government isn't reacting in the way you like, that may not be because they're all miserable SOBs. It may be because they're genuinely wrestling in the most good faith effort possible to reconcile these incommensurable or potentially incommensurable problems in the short run, at least. Let me say one other quick thing, which is the language of special interests. I don't think it's particularly helpful. There are examples of special interests, and I've written in my book on Adam Smith about rent extraction and lobbying as a form of special interest. That I don't think is what, in the best sense, we're talking about now. We're talking about people who have important, valid claims on public resources, who will be left out potentially of a set of policy changes, and how you include them, how you make them part of that picture, how you're able to persuade them that the future that you see and that we see is a future that they can see and can embrace. And how do you do it? How you organize the phasing and the national spirit that may sustain that. So what it comes down to is an idea of consent. And again, I think one person's consent is another person's pandering. We have to be careful about that, because ultimately it's going to be a basis of constructed long-term consent that underlies the kind of radical policy transformation that certainly the people on this conference would like to see, probably almost without exception. And it's also going to constrain the shorter term measures that are going to be required to achieve that transformation. So perhaps with those thoughts and that slight challenge, I can leave it for any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Minister, for those.
Please call me Jesse. I can't really deal with
Jesse, sorry. Okay, very good.
I will start looking around for people.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Jesse. We're actually up right up against the scheduled finish time. So perhaps we can leave your challenge hanging there for the economists to go away and think about, and then come back to you at some point. But what I'm going to do at this stage, thank you again, Jesse, for the very forthright and thoughtful comments. It is a pleasure to hear a minister talking in such clear terms about these issues. So I'm going to now ask Cameron Hepburn if he wants to make some final closing comments. I'm not going to ask him to summarize everything we've heard in the last 2 hours, but I am going to ask him to, and maybe if he wants to have an initial go at responding to Jesse's challenge, perhaps he can make that, and then I'll say some very final thank yous at the end. But over to you, Cameron.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks everybody, and thanks in particular, Jesse, for a rather unusually, perhaps not for you, but wise and sophisticated set of comments. Your lack of partisanship on these issues is very welcome, and your thoughtfulness is welcome indeed. And I think those of us on this discussion recognize the challenges that leaders have to face. And Lawrence Wainwright from Sweden, soon to be Oxford, I might add, asked a very good question about political leadership, and we welcome the leadership that we do have in this area. I'm not going to seek to rise to the challenge or even the bait yet, but that's hopefully for another day. But I just want to end in thanking our colleagues and friends at the LSE. Thanks, Bob, for masterful sharing. Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Beata. Thanks, Nick, for some very thoughtful remarks, and Amar too, and my fellow panelists, Helen, Amal-Lee, and Dimitri, as ever, stimulating, thought-provoking, and I hope those of you tuning in and listening have taken something away. I hope everybody, has learned at least one or two interesting things. So thanks once again, and look, this conversation will continue for at least another matter of months, if not another couple of years. It depends on that deep uncertainty. Is it V-shaped, or are we in for a second or possibly a third wave? So watch this space. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Cameron. It just remains for me to do some final thank yous. First of all, thank you to Cameron and Ben Caldecott and his team at Oxford at Smith School for their help in doing this, and indeed for the initial idea. If you have not yet had a look at it, please do look at the paper that Cameron sent the link for. It's an excellent piece of work led by Cameron and other authors looking at what could be learned from previous stimulus events. I should apologize to those of you who were watching on YouTube. We had some initial technical difficulties at the start, which meant that the first few minutes were not streamed. We have recorded from the point that it picked up onwards, and you can access the recording of the entire event through going to the Grantham Research Institute website, the page for this event. Finally, let me just thank in particular Zoe Williamson and Merlin Sibley here at LSE, who've done all the hard work of managing the technical side of it. And thank you to all the speakers and the panelists, and of course thank you to our audience who logged in through Zoom and who watched this on YouTube. And I hope you enjoy the rest of London Climate Action Week. Thank you.